Some people are scared to try kitbashing because they think it's expensive or they're worried they might screw up their expensive miniatures. But kitbashing doesn't have to be expensive, it can actually be cheaper. In this video, I'll show you how to save money using kitbashes, why I finally gave Warhammer Age of Sigmar a chance, and how kitbashing inspired me to convert an entire Cities of Sigmar army. When you think of a kitbash, you might think of something like Pete the Wargamer's incredible Grey Knight's Saturnine Dread Knight, which, in Canadian dollars, is a combination of a $98 kit and a $135 kit. While it's an incredible conversion to be sure, it's not the kind of kitbash that's going to save you any money. At least in the case of the Saturnine Dreadnought, you can acquire it as part of a box game starter set. It's no secret that Warhammer starter sets are some of the best value for your money. It's partly why most hobbyists' first exposure to Warhammer is through a starter set. A quick tally shows that if you were to buy all the contents of this box separately, you'd have to pay upwards of $715. What this means in practical terms is that you can save a lot of money if you are kitbashing with starter set miniatures. On top of that, even if you don't want to buy a whole starter set, you will be able to find sellers who will part out the individual kits for much less than buying them as standalone kits. Alternatively, if you're like me and have been collecting Warhammer for a long time, it's very likely that you've purchased many starter sets over the years, and you haven't necessarily used up all the models from these kits. In my own collection, I still have parts kicking around from Warhammer Fantasy starter sets for 6th edition, 7th edition, 8th edition, as well as some Stormcast from the 1st and 2nd editions of Warhammer Age of Sigmar, which I picked up from my local hobby shop for cheap. But the very first Games Workshop starter set that I ever owned is still kind of my favorite, and it's probably not what you expect. I have been obsessed with miniatures since first laying eyes on Hero Quest, a Milton Bradley board game that Games Workshop developed and released in North America in 1990, when I was just 6 years old. I particularly loved this set of 4 Chaos Warriors and their Chaos Warlock Master. But it wasn't until 1996 that I learned that Hero Quest and its sequel Battle Masters both belong to the world of Warhammer Fantasy. I can still remember my first purchases at Games Workshop Square One in Mississauga, Ontario, Canada. Warhammer Armies Chaos and a blister pack of 25mm bases. The army book for the Chaos faction contained all the rules I needed to use my favorite armor-clad warriors to play a game of Warhammer Fantasy. I just had to get them on the proper bases. As I was only 12 years old and my funds were limited, I rounded up as many Hero Quest and Battle Masters figures as I could, buying them off of my friends. My older brother took the orcs and goblins, and I took the Chaos miniatures. I spent hours using a file like this one, often giving myself blisters and calluses, shaving off all the plastic below the feet of these Hero Quest miniatures, just so that I could get them on to these black square bases. Getting the most from my first purchases, I even used this bit of sprue that the bases came on to convert standard bearers and musicians for my regiments. These were my very first kitbashes. Combined with a few more Chaos boxed sets, and a generous gift from Santa that year, I had a full Chaos army. For the next 19 years, my brothers and I enjoyed Warhammer Fantasy on and off through each edition, from 5th to 6th to 7th, and finally 8th edition. As I alluded to, pretty well each time we bought the box game that came with the new edition. Every once in a while, though, Games Workshop would seem to drop support for a whole army. The period of 6th to 7th edition was a particularly dark time for the Chaos Dwarves, but that's another story. It was times like these, especially after new editions of the core game were released, where you really had to decide whether to hold out hope of getting updated rules for your existing army or to move on to a new and well-supported army. Never was this more apparent than when Games Workshop replaced Warhammer Fantasy with Warhammer Age of Sigmar, effectively deleting every army in the fantasy range, from high elves to dwarves. This not only invalidated your completed army projects, but also your incomplete projects as well. I remember feeling like my small horde of unpainted starter set miniatures for Warhammer Fantasy might never find their home in a proper army ever again. To help ease the transition, Games Workshop released PDF rules, now called War Scrolls, that allowed you to field your existing Warhammer Fantasy models in Age of Sigmar. They even repackaged Warhammer Fantasy's 8th edition starter box, Isle of Blood, as Spire of Dawn, replacing all the square bases with circle bases. And although Games Workshop didn't initially require gamers to rebase their fantasy armies onto circle bases to play Age of Sigmar, it was definitely a decision that many of us felt compelled to make. Should you leave your army on square bases and continue to play 8th edition Warhammer Fantasy, or embrace the circle base and chart a new course in the mortal realms? Like many, I wasn't thrilled about Games Workshop ending Warhammer Fantasy, and I certainly was skeptical of the new game that replaced it. My hobby projects sat in limbo, and I watched with fascination as the first edition of Warhammer Age of Sigmar kicked off in the summer of 2015. The temporary digital army rules soon gave way to new battletomes, and over Age of Sigmar's first edition, many former fantasy armies now had official rules in the new setting, some even forging new identities properly situated in the mortal realms. Armies like Fire Slayers and Kharadron Overlords were a new vision for dwarfs, and Ideneth Deepkin seemed to be a new riff on elves. 2018 rolled around, and the second edition of Warhammer Age of Sigmar arrived, along with the new 3-year cadence for new editions. AOS 2 delivered a stunning reimagining of an undead faction for the Realm of Death. The Mortal Realms really had begun to forge its own identity, and in May 2019, with the release of the Hedonites of Slaanesh, there was now a battletome for each Chaos God, which, as a longtime Chaos fanboy, this was kinda cool to see. One common criticism of the setting still remained. What are the stakes in this universe? What are we fighting for? As the lore for this universe was being established, we were told that the mighty Stormcast Eternals were the warriors protecting humanity from chaos. Humans lived in huge, sprawling cities, the biggest of which, Azerheim, was renowned for its diverse population, which included humans, elves, and Dwarden. But after 4 years developing the setting, where was the dedicated Order faction for the free folk that lived in these cities? In my last video, I mentioned how inspiring White Dwarf articles can be, especially when they feature lovingly crafted armies by fellow hobbyists. Some comments on that video even lamented that they wish that modern White Dwarfs still had that same magic. Well, I'm here to tell you that they often do. The November 2016 issue of White Dwarf featured a completely kitbashed army from Azerheim, the Army of Hallowguild by Chris Peach, and it was truly a sight to behold. Peachy had blended together kits from Dark Elves, Dwarfs, and Empire to create a totally unique looking army that perfectly fit the aesthetic of the Mortal Realms. A particular standout were these handgunners, which blended Free Guild greatswords and Iron Drakes to create this completely unique and awesome looking regiment. The army also featured a contingent of Stormcast Eternals and a wonderful war altar as a centerpiece. Many Warhammer kits are dual purpose, allowing you to build one unit type or a second unit type. It is with these leftover bits that you can accomplish some really effective kit bashing for cheap. Here's Chris saying as much while being interviewed by the AOS coach.
And all sorts of stuff, and I made like this map, and then in the center was a place called Hallowguild. And as you can see there with the...
But this to me was like where I went, holy shite. Converting was never a thing, and then Age of Sigmar opened me up, and then I saw potential through the likes of you and many others, and I'm like, I want to now do this. That was what inspired me to start Armies on Parade for the first time.
And there was a couple of things I wanted to do. I wanted like the races working together, but I wanted my Stormcast to be seen as like the Space Marine equivalent, not like lots of them, but like a handful of them. But I was going down the route of like, I've got a bits box, I've got loads of stuff, because like, no, I'm going to go down the route of if I'm a hobbyist at home and I've got like a budget, and then I'll work around. And that, I think that actually helped me a lot more, because that's pushed my conversions a bit more. So when I built my Eternal Guard, I didn't want them as Eternal Guard. I quite like big double-handed blades, so I was like, well, I'll do them as Wildwood Rangers, but I want to save the hoods for something else because they've got masks on and they look cool, they look a bit mystical. Might save those for some humans. So I gave the Wildwood Rangers Eternal Guard heads, and I wasn't bothered by that because I thought they looked cool because they got nice crests. Save the heads for the greatswords. I think that was my favourite conversion of the whole lot because it was so simple, but made the greatswords look not like Empire.
I think a lot of people either go onto Twitter or Instagram and see these incredible, crazy kit bashes conversions, people using 5 kits for one model, and that can be very cost prohibitive and very limiting. And converting kit bashing, building a theme, to me doesn't have to be buy 7 kits to make one unit of 5 that dies to a stiff breeze. It could be just looking through your bits box.
Yeah.
It could be.
Chris proved that you could make some really effective kit bashes using leftover arms and heads from one box set and swapping them with those of another. You could tell that Peachy had a clear vision for what he was trying to achieve, and it was a truly inspiring army. As someone who was only paying attention casually to the Age of Sigmar setting, this army made me sit up and take notice. On September 23rd, 2019, Games Workshop previewed a brand new battletome, the Cities of Sigmar. it immediately brought to mind Chris Peach's army. Much like Peachy's army, the lore once again stressed that the Cities of Sigmar was a faction composed of elves, humans, dwarven, and even stormcast. The faction focus article had a few very cool images from the new battletome that showed off the various allegiances and allies that were possible with the new set of rules, and it was again inspiring to see these seemingly disparate forces painted in a unifying color scheme. Just look at the strong visual identities that the battletome established. The Living City, Hallowheart, Phoenicium, Greywater Fastness, Tempest Eye, Anvil Guard, and Hammerhall. Even though the release didn't have a single new miniature to accompany it, the Free Peoples finally had dedicated rules that went beyond what was established in the original Order battletome. It got me thinking, perhaps I had found a real home for all my unpainted Warhammer Fantasy miniatures. Maybe this was finally my chance to repurpose some of my beloved miniatures and get them on some new bases. This is when an idea of my own began to take shape. If the Cities of Sigmar were truly as metropolitan as the lore was suggesting, surely they weren't segregated into their own communities. They would fight side by side in the same units, in common guilds based on their individual training and experience. And that's when I mocked up my first concept for a mixed unit of heavily armored hammerers. I posted the concept on Instagram, and a few people liked it, so I felt like I was kind of onto something. After 4 years of waiting, I decided that I would finally give Age of Sigmar a chance. But would I stick with it? To find out, I set myself some goals for my new army project. Goal 1. Build my first army since Fantasy ended, and pay tribute to Chris Peach's army. Goal 2. I wanted the army to feel like an Age of Sigmar force, and not a Warhammer Fantasy one. Goal 3. Each unit should have a mix of fantasy races. And as always, Goal 4. I wanted to use up as many fantasy kits as I could and build on a budget. It was time to put all of those starter set miniatures to good use. I started taking the concept further. I knew I wanted a version of Peachy's handgunners, so I got some leftover dwarf bits from my friend Jeff and set to work. Pretty soon I had 10 hammerers, 10 handgunners, and a small trio of greatswords. I was truly using bits from the entire history of Warhammer Fantasy plastics. Shadow Warrior helmets, Chaos Warrior legs, Dwarven hammerers, and of course Empire Knights and State Troops. I even managed to scrape together 5 Free Guild Outriders using bits donated by my friends Gary and Robert. Sometimes asking your friend for leftover bits can be one of the most inexpensive things you can do. Next, I worked on a unit of Rangers, aka Shadow Warriors, and started getting some serious Rittermark vibes. I followed up with a unit of Free Guild Guard with sword and shield. It was really fun mixing dwarves and elves into this unit. You barely ever see dwarves with swords these days. I also enjoyed giving them these round shields from the 6th edition fantasy box game. I just had to scrape off the lion emblems from them and sand them smooth. I worked on a few more units, including a steam tank, which I cobbled together from a servo hauler set. Credit here goes to Tesseria Graham for that awesome idea. I further expanded on this concept by adding an engine caboose, which harkened back to the old Empire steam tank model from 4th edition fantasy. In just over 3 months, on January 10th, 2020, I had assembled this force and still had ideas for many more conversions. I even squeezed in a halfling. As I said, I really wanted to live up to Chris Peach's army and ensure that this felt like an army of the mortal realms. Thus, including a unit of Stormcast Eternals was an easy choice. The majority of the models in this unit I got for next to nothing from my local hobby shop, as they were leftover demo figs from the 1st edition of Age of Sigmar. Reposing static figs like this is much easier than you think. Just by twisting hands, heads, and waists, you can create new poses, each with their own silhouette. Lastly, I concepted a totally insane kitbash for a Celestial Hurricanum. My goal was to symbolize the entire mortal realms with a kind of planetary orrery. It was pretty fun, but I felt like it was a bit too big and too goofy, and ultimately I went in a different direction. In order to really sell the fact that these guys belong to a city, I wanted the army to feature cobblestone bases. For a while, I had been eyeing the texture rollers produced by Green Stuff World, and I decided to pick one up. I ordered the small bricks pattern and began making bases. It took a bit of elbow grease, but I banged out 70 bases or so. I buy green stuff in these large tubes, which is far more economical than the usual strips you might see. I also experimented with some textured cobblestone plastic card, which I used on my larger bases. started painting the army that April and began with 3 test figures. I must have been watching Duncan Rhodes' videos on YouTube because I opted to prime them gray. I really liked the cover art for the Cities of Sigmar battletome and didn't want to deviate from it too much. I wanted this army to be as Sigmar-y as possible to fit the setting. To that end, I used a simple scheme of blue and gold with red accents. I was reasonably happy with the test models, so I finished painting the unit to a simple tabletop standard. Nothing too fancy or impressive, but they look nice enough as a unit. Next, I had a real blast painting my steam tank, being sure to take cues from the old 4th edition version. It took me 5 years, but I finally painted my first Stormcast Eternal. I actually took my time on this model, following Duncan's tutorial as closely as possible. I was really satisfied with the result, but didn't end up painting the whole unit to this same standard, mostly to save time. I rarely work on a single project at a time, and I had been painting all sorts of models during this project. By July, I had painted a nice battalion-sized force, and I posted a small video on Instagram of all the models I had painted in the past 6 months. 173 models. As you can see, I also started work on a Slaanesh force for AOS. I slacked off a bit after this, and it wasn't until May of 2021 that I resumed painting my Cities of Sigmar army. I forced myself to bang out some base coats, then details, and finally some wizards, and then I was done. I did it. 2,000 points of battle-ready city folk in just 16 months. I had originally been aiming for the project to take only 8 months, but I'll take it. Army projects are rarely a straight line. As I was building the army, I wasn't sure which of the various cities' rules I would use for my force, but I settled on using the army list for the City of Hallowguild, which has a magic focus. That said, the army is painted in the colors of the City of Hammerhall. So, I called the army the Collegiate Arcanum of Hammerhall, imagining that they represent the College of Magic within the city. In the end, I got to use models from no less than 6 different starter sets, including this pillar which came from the Lord of the Rings starter set. So I had accomplished my goals. I had my very own army in the style of the Hallowguild. My mixed units concept was getting some lovely feedback on Instagram and Reddit, and I got to use up a ton of great Warhammer Fantasy models in a way that felt at home in the mortal realms. But our story doesn't end here. I managed to play a few games of 2nd edition with this army, but then Games Workshop released the 3rd edition of Age of Sigmar in July 2021. AOS 3 boasted some seriously cool new designs for the Stormcast Eternals, which meant that my newly completed army had already begun to show its age. But no big deal, right? Games Workshop provided some digital updates to help existing armies make the transition to the new edition, even going so far as to point out that Demigryph Knights and Shadow Warriors would be even better in this edition. 15 months later, Games Workshop started previewing something for the new Dawnbringer Crusades. The Warhammer studio is currently hard at work at redesigning the Cities of Sigmar. While this was an interesting preview in and of itself, it definitely seemed to suggest a hard departure from the current incarnation of the Cities of Sigmar. Then in March of 2023, Games Workshop previewed the brand new redesigns of Cities of Sigmar, and these new designs were indeed a big shift. More previews trickled out over the next few months, and in July 2023, they previewed the full army set for the newly designed army. While it was cool that the Cities of Sigmar were getting their own unique identity, the concept of Sigmar's army being composed of elves, humans, and dwarfs had been greatly diminished. They even said as much in their range announcement. The article goes on to identify all the units no longer included in the Cities of Sigmar, which included all the old Free Guild units, Demigryph Knights, and Shadow Warriors. Coupled with the fact that there no longer seemed to be a way to ally in Stormcast units, my army was basically made unplayable. I thought long and hard about whether I would buy the new Cities of Sigmar battletome. I could maybe run my swordsmen as steel helms and my range units as fusiliers or iron drakes, but my outriders and stormcasts really didn't seem to have a place. And really, the whole conceit of my army was absent from this battletome. Gone were the awesome pictures of elves, humans, and dwarves and stormcasts in united color schemes, replaced with the armies composed of only one faction, just humans, or just dwarves, or just elves. So do I buy this new battletome or what? Let's add a bit of context about what I was thinking at the time. While I was working on my Cities of Sigmar army, I had also been building a Hedon Knights of Slaanesh force as a side project, and I managed to complete about 1,500 points or so. When I start a new game, I like to have at least 2 opposing factions so I can play the games without relying on the armies of others. As a reward to myself for getting that far with my Chaos force, I purchased the Hedon Knights of Slaanesh battletome and the Slaves to Darkness battletome. But then, in what seemed like no time at all, my Hedonites battletome was made obsolete with the release of a new version. In fact, I looked it up, and the first version of the Hedonites battletome came out in May 2019, and the second in February of 2021. Just 21 months apart. That's 2 battletomes for the same army in the same edition of AOS. Then my Slaves to Darkness battletome was replaced in 2022. At the time, I figured, oh well, I just bought the battletomes too near to the end of their natural life cycle, my bad, and I bought the 2 updated books. But these books are not cheap. They are thick, hardcover tomes currently priced at $74 Canadian each. That's why I couldn't believe it when a third Hedonites battletome dropped just 25 months after the second. If you are keeping track, that's 3 battletomes for the same army in less than 4 years. So I didn't buy the third Hedonites battletome, and I didn't buy the new Cities of Sigmar battletome either. I decided I would just hold off and retire both of my AOS armies to the display cabinet. So that was my first taste of the codex churn of a modern mainline Warhammer game, and it was pretty bitter. I can't imagine I'm alone in this feeling. If you were a Hedonites player through this period, please let me know in the comments what this experience was like for you. And if you had a Cities of Sigmar army based on the first battletome, what did you do when the redesign happened? The whole time I was making an attempt with Age of Sigmar, Warhammer The Old World was slowly being previewed, and it was finally released in January of 2024. The Old World took a new approach with their book releases. They initially released 3 hardcover books: the rulebook, Forces of Fantasy, which contained their rules for the Forces of Order, Ravening Hordes, which contained the rules for the Forces of Chaos and Destruction, and any army not included in these books was given a PDF as a legacy faction. To supplement the army lists, the Old World team now releases softcover arcane journals with a sticker price of $34 Canadian. Moreover, these journals supplement, not replace, what was released in the hardcover books, which is an approach I am liking so far. While this strategy for releasing rules feels more palatable to me, 2027 is fast approaching, and it will be interesting to see if a whole new set of books will be required if they release a second edition for Warhammer The Old World. This recently happened to the Horus Heresy, and people weren't exactly pleased about it. This sort of book churn is probably why I've been investing more and more in old Games Workshop publications, like these Realm of Chaos books, Rogue Trader, and most recently a copy of Mordheim. And I've still got my sights set on acquiring a copy of Inquisitor and Warhammer Fantasy Battles 3rd edition. But just because you take some time off from an army doesn't mean you can't return to it later when inspiration hits. At Adepticon this year, Games Workshop previewed a brand new unit for the Cities of Sigmar, a giant walking castle tower. Since any army can field one of these, AOS fans have been dreaming up some pretty awesome looking kitbashes. I myself have been toying with the idea of scratch building a cog fort, just for fun. With new models comes a new battletome, but will this new set of war scrolls make my existing army any easier to field? Will there be suitable counts as substitutions that I can make, or will I have to run my steam tank as a cog fort if the steam tank war scroll is removed? Working on this army again would give me a chance to paint up these old starter set kitbashes that I had initially planned on adding to the army. I really hope there will be suitable war scrolls for these to use. This whole experience has made me wonder, just how long should I expect an army to be playable after completing it? Just 3 years maximum? That doesn't seem like a lot of time to me. So should I add to my Cities of Sigmar army or just leave it alone? Or maybe I should continue to build it as a 2nd edition Age of Sigmar Cities of Sigmar army, and I could seek out opponents who want to play older versions of the game. That's certainly something that Warhammer Fantasy players are known for doing. In the years to come, will there be people who are nostalgic for the early editions of AOS? Or was it all for naught? Should I rebase my Cities of Sigmar back onto square bases and call them a Middenheim army or something? I really don't know. I try not to be a doomer about Warhammer. It's a fun hobby that I've derived endless hours of enjoyment from. Games Workshop is a business and progress marches on, but I'm hopeful that my Cities of Sigmar army will see the battlefield again one day. I'm just not sure when or how that will take place. What do you think I should do with my Collegiate Arcanum of Hammerhall? Let me know. It's interesting to compare my Age of Sigmar army building experience with my Nurgle 40k army building experience from my previous video. This Death Guard force was based on an army from 1996, and practically everything in it can still be fielded 30 years later. So that's quite a contrast. And I have to say, I was completely blown away by the reception to my last video. It hit 20,000 views in just 9 days and has more likes and comments than any video I have ever made. Over 1,100 of you subscribed to my channel after watching it, launching me well past my goal of 5,000 subscribers, and I'm truly grateful for your kind words of support. While I don't expect this video to perform quite as well, I have definitely considered doing more videos in this same army essay format. If you dig it, leave a like and subscribe. I've got a bunch of army projects that deserve their own videos. This is Xander's Arcane Study. Thanks for watching.